Good morning. For a scripture reading this morning, I'd like to read from Psalms, chapter 68th Psalm. I'll be reading the first 6 verses. So Psalm 68, 1 through 6, if you'd like to follow along. Let God arise, let his enemies be scattered. Let them also that hate him flee before him. As smoke is driven away, so drive them away. As wax melteth before the fire, so let the wicked perish at the presence of God. But let the righteous be glad. Let them rejoice before God. Yea, let them exceedingly rejoice. Sing unto God. Sing praises to his name. Extol him that rideth upon the heavens by his name Jah, and rejoice before him. A father of the fatherless and a judge of the widows is God in his holy habitation. God sitteth the solitary in families. He bringeth out those which are bound with chains, but the rebellious dwell in a dry land. A father to the fatherless. I'm going to tell you about myself more than many of you know. Some of you have known me for years and years, and you know parts of this. My parents divorced before I turned 2. It was just my mom and I. We were living in Pittsburgh at the time, and my mom moved back to Independence, or moved to Independence. I had never lived in Independence, so I guess I couldn't move back. And so it was just her and I. This was back in the 70s, and she fortunately had a teaching degree, and so it was just my mom and I, but she was able to get a somewhat decent job. At the time, teaching salaries were pretty low. We actually qualified for food stamps when she was a full-time teacher, and it was just the 2 of us. But we were blessed so much. I remember at night, as we'd be having our prayers, that she would pray. And I still had a father. I didn't see him when I was younger. Didn't see him at all. He wasn't really a part of my life. He moved back to the Detroit area, which is where I was born, and lived there until I was older. And she would pray at night that God would be a father to me, and that he would send people to be in my life to fill that role that I didn't have. And so I still remember upstairs in a little duplex we had on 39th and Noland, we're offering those prayers. And I have to tell you, God answers prayers. One thing about being a father, I became a father in old age, and I became so much more emotional. I don't know, for those of you who are dads, like I didn't used to cry hardly at all, but now I have kids and I cry all the time. Not all the time, but for some reason, like it's much easier to cry now with 2 little boys. I don't know what it is. I'll blame them on it. And so I'm going to tell about some of the fathers that God put into my life. The first, I was blessed that my mom had the foresight to be really active in church, and so there was people at church that were around. But she also put me in Boy Scouts and in Cub Scouts. And the first father is a man named Art Main. And I don't know if any of you knew Art Main. He was a member of the church. He stayed with the Community of Christ Church. But he was this big, huge guy. He had been like a linebacker when he was younger, just a big man. And I was a little boy, and he was a big man. I was a little 11-year-old boy going to Boy Scout camp. And I have to tell you, Boy Scout camp at 11-year-old, when you were raised by a single mom, it's not easy because like you're away from mama and like for 10 days. It's not like a 2-day camp or 3-day camp or a camp with like mother type figures around. This is like you and a bunch of other like preteen and teenage boys and old burly men who smell bad. And so it's not a nurturing, it's nurturing in a lot of ways, but one of our leaders was Art Main. And he was this huge like hulking guy. But he was like one of the most loving and caring people I had ever met. And he made everybody feel just like they were the most important person to him. Gave big hugs, had just a huge smile on his face, and was just always happy. And I remember like a Visitor Sunday. For those of you who don't know Boy Scout camp, it's usually 10 days long. And somewhere in there, there's a Visitor Sunday. if there's 2 Sundays, it's typically the second, unless like the second Sunday is like the last day of camp or something. So it's usually the latter half of camp is like when my visitor Sundays used to be. And like I would always beg, like the first 2 years, I'd beg Mom, just take me home. Like I've been here long enough. Like I've done my time. Like surely this is enough. Can I please go home? And she's like, no, you need to stay. And I remember that second year, she had made me stay, and I stayed to the end. And I remember just going up to Art and just saying, I wish you were my dad. Because I just remember that love that he gave me and being just so, it was just such a joyful thing to be around him. And I just remember that. The next father type figure, Jim Bailey. Some of you know Jim. Aaron was and is one of my best friends. And for those of you who don't know Jim very well, he is like just, I would call in a lot of ways, and this is a perspective of not his natural son, so I'm sure Aaron saw some different perspectives of him, but mostly just unbounding love. I mean, if I were to explain Jim in one thing, that'd be pretty much, just loved everybody, would love you. He was, usually smiling. He also had the father cry gene pretty well. He would cry pretty easily. But I remember going over and playing with Aaron and just loving being around Jim, because he was always just a loving, caring person. And he clearly loved his children. He clearly loved his wife and was so good to them. The next one is actually Jim Coney, Charity's dad. And sorry, Charity, I might tear up a couple times. I'm sorry. I got the pleasure of working for Jim and being good friends with Charity and with James. And I remember I have to share a couple of Jim stories. First off, he had a tool shop where he sharpened end mills, which if you don't know what end mills are, they're basically like a drill bit and like a big metal drill bit. And Jim was intense. Is that okay to say, Charity? Okay, yeah, Jim was an intense, and he was also like didn't mince words and would be like very straightforward, and which is great for a father. Like there's times where you have to do that, and so I was blessed that I was able to see that, because I used to grind these end mills on a big lathe, like a huge lathe, and like if you took off too much metal, because you're taking off just little like microscopic amounts of metal when you're grinding these things, and if you took off too much, you could tell, like you could hear it. And I wasn't good at this, I clearly, as an elementary school principal, I clearly didn't follow that career path, but I could tell when I had taken off too much metal. And you hear this, like if you're like screwing in something, you can, I see, if you've done anything where you're talking drill bits, you can tell when you've done too much. And I could feel him looking at me, like standing there, I could just feel like, oh, Jim's watching me right now. And the hard part is like there was usually 3 blades. And so if you did it once, you had to do the same thing to 2 other blades, because you couldn't just have it uneven on these little drill bits. And so like if you heard that grind once, you just like, okay, I have to do it 2 more times, and it's not gonna be happy. And so like I remember just going through and doing that. But he also would entrust people with things. One time, I think you were there, Charity, I know James was there, we went on a big camping trip. Jim was the one who would take us on adventures. And I remember piling in the back, I think it was a big old red pickup truck, and we were in the mountains now near Rolla, down area, like the Ozarks, and it was near Jim's parents' house. And their dog came along, Frankie, and we had a pickup truck and a trailer, and all the kids were piled in the back of the pickup truck. For those of you who are younger, we used to do that, and we survived mostly. And so we're piled back to the pickup truck going through this mountain road, and Frankie, unfortunately, kind of was jumping in and out of the truck and just being everywhere. And Frankie got run over by the truck trying to jump back in. Unfortunately, it was not a quick thing, and Frankie was suffering. And Jim told me, like, if Frankie doesn't die quick, you're going to have to shoot Frankie. Because he couldn't do it. He couldn't make James do it. And I guess I was the next one who he trusted to do it. And just the fact that he would trust me, even though it was fortunately, Frankie passed away rather quickly. Just to give you the end of the story. Frankie didn't suffer very long, and I didn't have to shoot Frankie, which I'm afraid I would still remember way too vivid. I still remember helping bury Frankie, so I can only imagine trying to like shoot Frankie, how bad that would be. But just the trust that he gave, the trust and accountability, I think is were good attributes that I learned from Jim. The next is Jack Higginson. Many of you know Jack. I call Jack Grandpa Jack a lot of times. Jack and I have been back, it's been 20 years ago now, we would do a lot of church camps together. And there were times where we'd be in the same cabin, and Jack's a snorer, for those who don't know. And my wife's not in the room right now. She's in the nursery, so I can tell you, I don't snore. And so there'd be times where Jack and I would be in the same cabin. And for those of you who've been to Nam Nostra, raise your hand if you've been to Nam Nostra before. For those of you who've been to camps before, a few of you, several hands. Rita might have been around those times. I'm not sure. Kathy may have been there. But Jack and I were in where they usually do the log. And so there was like this one room, and then there was like four bedrooms off the one master room. And they usually did a log in there, and Jack and I had one of those rooms. And I think he was the pastor, and I did the campfires, and so the two of us kind of had our own place. And it was a race every night to see who could get to sleep the fastest. Because if you lost the race, that meant the other one was going to be snoring rather rigorously. The people working on the log said it was just like a couple chainsaws going in the room right next to him. And so, but Jack and I have had like countless conversations, and the mentorship that he provided was such a blessing. Another was Richard Neal. I got the opportunity back in 93 and 94 to go to New Jersey. And I lived in his actually childhood home with Aaron Bailey. And the two of us did missionary work ranging from Maine all the way down to Florida. And Richard was kind of our mentor / leader / administrator for when we were missionaries. And the daily worship, the study. The other day I found some old files on a computer and found like old journals from when we were in the Youth Missionary Corps, and like the amount of studying. I think like if I could freeze time and spend as much time as I did during that year in study and preparation, and just having that much one-on-one conversations with somebody who knew way more than I did about the Lord, how much better off I'd be. The next is Gary Hawley. Some of you know Gary. Some of you are related to Gary. I was blessed to off and on work for Gary. And for those who don't know Gary, Gary's a shorter guy, big and round. He is one of these like deceptively strongest people I've ever seen. He's one of those people that he's been a carpenter pretty much his whole life. He could like take a nail, like a 16-penny nail, which is like a big nail. Put it in, just like with one hand, he'd put it in, and with the other hand, just drive it. And like completely flush drive it with one swing. It takes me a few swings. Like in my prime, when I was doing this when I was working for him, maybe like 3 good swings, I could do it. Like clean, one swing, it's buried, like every time. Gary was just such a neat guy. He is such a neat guy. He's still around. He's lost a leg, but he's still around, thankfully. When we worked for him, at the time, he was directing senior high camps, and Aaron and I were helping out, and so Aaron Bailey and I, and so we would take like 2-hour lunch breaks that turned into lunch / camp planning meetings, and just being able to spend hours talking about camps and how we were going to help minister to the young people. It was just a blessing. Now, the next is my stepfather, Roger Resch. And last time I spoke, talked a little bit about Roger and his current situation. He's dying of Alzheimer's right now. And Roger and I, for those of you who've known me for a while, have not always we've kind of been up and down. My mom got married to him when I was 14, which is not a great age to establish a stepfather typically. Being just my mom and I, we had a relationship where she would talk to me all the time. I love my mom dearly. We would talk through things. She was obviously the mom. I was obviously the kid. But she would talk through decisions we were making. She would talk and just kind of help me process through things. And Roger was not a talker of through things. He was a dictator of things. And so I know in his way he loved me, and in my way I loved him, but we didn't always click. But I learned a lot from him. I learned a lot about a lot of handyman type stuff. I learned a lot of just some absolutes that he was very good at. The next is my father-in-law, Dick Bartow. Most of you, unless you've seen him here visiting, you probably don't know Dick. There's a lot of things I could say about him. He's like, I've talked a lot about people that were handy. Dick is not handy at all. He's not a handy person, but he sacrifices for his family. One of the things that I love the most about him is he's like the consummate yes dear husband. And he does such a fabulous job of whatever the family needs, he does, and he helps. Whether that means he has to sacrifice his own wants and desires, he does it. And he does it without complaint. And not that his life is hard. Really, don't let me confuse you. But I learned a lot about just being able just to do what's needed. The last is my own father. My dad, he actually just moved back into the area. When I was growing up, he moved into town when I was about 7 or so. He lived around. It was a typical, I guess, divorced parent situation where I'd see him like every other weekend or a couple weekends a month or something like that. But it wasn't until really honestly, till I graduated college. We established he was working on moving to Florida because my grandmother was in Florida, and he just wanted to get down there, and my stepmom and him, she actually moved ahead of him and got a job. And so he was here on a job before they were trying to just reestablish. And so for about a year, they had a long-distance marriage. And every week we would go eat sushi together. And I'm a picky eater, for those of you who don't know. I'm like a very picky eater, but for some reason, sushi just clicks with me. And so my dad and I would meet at Siki over by John Knox Village. Once a week, we would meet there. And we met there enough that like when I parked, my soup and my salad would be at at the seat I usually sat in before I got to the seat, because they recognized my car and they were like loading it up for me. And so, but the hours we spent, my dad and I, there, just talking and talking. And then when he moved to Florida, my stepmother developed brain cancer and passed away really quickly. And just the time we spent after she passed, and I was really the closest person to him, which is kind of a surreal feeling when you don't feel like you've been as close to your dad as you would like, and know that you're the one that needs to be with him for a couple weeks after Glenna passed. Fatherhood's hard. As a father, I have learned that. There's times I think, man, I would like to rewind like an hour and redo like an interaction with my boys or with my wife. But I can't imagine a better set of fathers than the one God provided me. I hope that in my life I can be a fraction to my boys and to those I come in contact with as those men were to me. To be part of the moral of the story is you don't have to have sons to be a father. You don't have to have daughters to be a father. You don't have to have sons or daughters to be a mother. There are so many people in this world that need ministry. Whether they be your kids, whether they be somebody else's, whether you're a kid yourself, there are those that need you. They need you to fill that gap. God rarely comes and does stuff in the flesh, but he uses you. The more willing you are, the more ready you are, he'll use you to minister for him. Whether it's in your job as a teacher, whether it's at a camp, whether it's whatever it is, the Lord will use you if you put yourself out there to be his hands and his feet.